So whilst everyone is taking their seats, I'll just give a bit of an introduction for Ingrid. So Ingrid is Associate Professor Ingrid van der Meij is a senior epidemiologist. She is originally from the Netherlands and came to Australia 20 years ago, where she started working at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research in Hobart. Her research focuses on identifying factors that cause MS and factors that influence the progression of the disease. She currently manages a number of research platforms, including the Australian MS Longitudinal Study, which is owned by MS Research Australia and aims to improve the lives of people with MS. Based on her own work and that of others, she will discuss aspects around modifiable lifestyle factors, other health conditions and employment. So thank you, Ingrid. Welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. All right, what are we talking about today? I think we all know about a lot of the challenges that people with MS face. You need to manage your symptoms, take those medications and they have side effects. They tell you to maintain a healthy lifestyle. You want to stay in employment as long as you can and be as productive as you possibly can. And then you might have some other health conditions as well that you need to deal with. So how do you do all of those things? And what's the evidence base behind it? So I'd like to talk through a number of those aspects that are on this list in how to manage those and in terms of what the evidence is that underlies that. Some things are common sense, but some things actually need a good evidence base. And for you to be convinced to be doing those things over and over and over, you'd like to have some evidence behind that. A little while ago, there was the Brain Health group that put out a report and some nice information, and they came up with 6 ways to lead a brain healthy lifestyle. And I quite like this, and hopefully you have seen it. If you haven't seen it, it's worthwhile downloading and reading through that. So I'd like to use that as a guide to talk through some of those healthy lifestyles for your brain. So let's tackle the first one. Keep as active as you can. So how do we do that? And why is that important? So they basically say higher levels of aerobic fitness are associated with faster, I can hardly read that. Maybe I should look that way. That's better for me. With faster information processing and preserved brain tissue volume. And this suggests that being as active as possible may help to preserve brain health in people with MS. So this group really takes the brain health perspective. What is good for your brain? I'd like to see that a little bit bigger as well. So the only guidelines we have are the Canadian Physical Activity Guidelines. They basically tell you to do roughly 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity 2 times a week and do some strength training exercises for major muscle groups about 2 times a week as well. So that's kind of the recommendation. But what's actually sitting behind that, and what is the evidence for that? So there are a number of groups of different lines of evidence, and I've actually been really impressed with the amount of evidence that's there, because physical activity is not only good for your aerobic fitness, but has a lot of other health benefits that go way beyond. So basically, physical activity has an influence on inflammation and neurodegeneration. There's reasonable evidence there. How powerful is that? It has influence on axonal damage and neuronal loss. It influences your mental state. We all know that. It influences fatigue. Basically, a little bit counterintuitive. I'm fatigued. I don't feel like doing physical activity, but in fact, it makes you feel a lot better and reduces your fatigue. So there's quite a bit of evidence around that as well. It influences depression, cognition. Of course, it influences your aerobic power and your muscle strength, but it can also influence your gait and your balance. It influences walking performance, quality of life, activities of daily living, recreation, leisure and work. So overall, it's pretty powerful what the effects can be. Then you can say, okay, how big is that effect? And this is a slide that kind of overviews that a little bit, where with those numbers, and around 0.2 is what we call a small effect. Small, but still a significant effect. About 0.5 is a medium effect, and 0.8 is a large effect. So if you look at those numbers, there you can see some of them are ranges because they are different studies. You can see the biggest effect is kind of happening for fatigue, 0.45 to 0.57. So that's like a medium effect. So there are no massive, really big effects where you say, okay, doing physical activity is going to make a massive influence on something. But a medium effect is still quite important. So depressive symptoms around 0.3 to 4. Cardiovascular fitness, between 0.47, 0.63. But I think the overwhelming evidence is that it has an effect on so many different things. And another important one is the one at the bottom, safety. It actually doesn't increase relapses. And that was nice to see that in a study. So if you ever were afraid that, physical activity might actually lead to a relapse, that doesn't seem to be the case. So then back to those guidelines. Nice to see some guidelines, to see some structure around how much should you be doing. It's quite hard to establish those. So that's why the other group went simply do as much as you can. But how do you then increase that participation, doing the physical activity? So one of the key things is choose your activities, choose what you like. We know with physical activity interventions, we do an intervention as a research group. You work out, okay, this is what we want people to do. We're telling them what to do those exercises, do this and do that. And they do that for 3 months. Then you measure before and after and you see a big increase. It works, it really works. And you test again after 6 months after you haven't told them they had to keep doing that exercise. Guess what happens? As we all do, we revert back to our norm. We just can't sustain it. And why can't you sustain it? Because it wasn't something you chose in the first place. It was something that you were told to do. So choose your activities that you really like, that you engage with. Control the level of engagement. Make sure that you decide on what is appropriate for you at that point in time. And get a bit of support around you as well. Expert support, social support. So you can have peers, because they can encourage you to actually be there. If you at 7 o'clock in the morning decided to walk the dog with a friend and she's going to be there as well, you're not going to let her down. So it really encourages you to be there. And it's more fun to have other people around. And people like a physiotherapist, they can provide advice. They also are there to encourage you and also assist to overcome barriers. And when we come to barriers, there's quite a bit of research around that. The barriers can be a massive number. So they can be around the environment. It's just too hard because there are no disabled facilities, no good parking, or the temperature isn't quite right. So how can you overcome those barriers? There's some social influences, minimal or conflicting advice, some social exclusion, some negative attitudes from others with MS. There might be some family distractions. It makes it all hard to do that physical activity. You can't quite get to it. You have some issues with fatigue or pain. Your symptoms are fluctuating. You have some other health issues. So lots of reasons why it becomes hard to do physical activity or exercise. And there will be some other things like fear, apprehension, some frustrations with your own limitations, the time management. It's just so hard to fit it all in. You simply forget about it. So lots of barriers, and so to work some of these out are very important. There are some programs that are being tested at the moment. One of them is called Blue Prescription. I quite like that. That's basically based around what I just told you. And there's another one by PAMS that is being tested. It's actually an online intervention. And initially I was like, really? Like, you need to do something in practice? But it is around goal setting. And as Sally mentioned, goal setting is very important. It's around overcoming barriers. It's about self-tracking. So you get a tracker, you basically work out how much you do and get that feedback. So it's about problem solving and overcoming a lot of those issues. Using an online environment or an app, something like that. So they're quite novel things, and they can really work in practice. Okay, moving to the next one, evidence on weight control. What we know is MS becomes more and more challenging with your symptoms. Life might become more and more sedentary, and as a result you will be more at risk of obesity or cardiovascular comorbidities or other cardiovascular health conditions. And what we know from the evidence is that in terms of risk of MS, we know that a body mass index in your teenage year is associated with MS risk. And in terms of the disease cause, we know that the rate of some of the obesity-related comorbidities are higher in people with MS compared to the general population. We know that some of those obesity-related comorbidities are associated with the disease or disability progression. We know from some of our own work that being overweight is associated with relapses and disability progression, and that hypertension and heart disease was also associated with some of the MRI outcomes, such as decreased grey matter and cortical volumes. So quite a bit of evidence that having that higher weight is basically not a good thing. So in general, I would say there's sufficient evidence to recommend that losing weight to get into that healthy range could basically reduce the accumulation of disability. And then in terms of how do you get there, well, back to my number one, physical activity, increasing and doing as much as you can will have a good impact. And then, of course, your diet, and I will talk about that in a minute. So number 3, keep your mind active. So they're basically saying, the brain health group, education, reading, hobbies and artistic or creative pastimes help to protect against cognitive problems in MS when pursued over a lifetime. When you look at the evidence, it's not massive yet in MS itself, but what we know from aging, normal aging and dementia is that there's more and more evidence building up that being as active as possible in terms of your brain, your cognitive function, doing things that are challenging you rather than just doing the boring, mundane things, it's like playing piano and doing all of those things are really useful and beneficial. I recently read the Brain Plasticity book from Norman Deutsch and really enjoyed that. And there they were talking about Posit Science, this app with brain exercises like Brain HQ. So of course I signed up for it, and unpaid version, and really did some exercises, and I really liked it. Guess how long I did it for? Okay, I'm just like everybody else. You do it for a while and then you don't do it. But I guess if you have MS, you might have that increased motivation to keep doing it. Oh, I think I decided that I was better off challenging myself on the piano than doing those exercises all the time, because I liked playing the piano a lot more. So that was my alternative of still doing something around my cognitive decline. But I was pleased to hear recently from Michael Barnett's group in Sydney that they are actually doing a randomised controlled trial using these brain exercises to see whether in people with MS that also works. So there's those brain exercises. They were very well designed, and they've done more than 100 publications in other areas, but not specific in MS. So that was nice to see that's actually happening. So that in terms of keeping your mind active. The next one, avoid smoking. Hopefully I'm talking to the converted here. Nobody smokes anymore. We basically know smoking is associated with the MS onset, so it's a risk factor. It's not a very strong risk factor, but nevertheless, about a 50% increased risk. And what we know is that smoking is associated with higher disability-related outcomes, higher relapse rate, more cognitive problems, and a reduced survival. So in general, this is sort of the graphing of it, where you look at a lot of different studies, and you see that the dotted line in the middle is the no effect, and you can see that most of these studies are sitting on the right-hand side, where you do see an effect of smoking on disability outcomes, and the average of all of the studies is about 1.55. And what you see is that confidence interval, the 1.10 to 2.19, it doesn't include 1, so we are certain enough that that is a significant effect and that it didn't happen by chance. So that's sort of how some of the research works to combine different studies. So overall, I think there's sufficient evidence to recommend don't smoke. But the quitting of smoking is, of course, incredibly challenging. For some, it's relatively easy. For others, it's very hard to do. But it's definitely sufficient evidence in terms of MS that would be a beneficial thing to do in terms of disease course. Next one, watch how much you drink. So they're basically saying unsafe levels of alcohol are associated with a reduced survival in MS. And for this one, I'm pretty much like, yes, unsafe levels of alcohol. We're talking about really excessive alcohol. I think that's an unhealthy thing. And it's pretty much a no-brainer to do that. If you look at the actual evidence in MS, it's actually not as clear-cut. Maybe the really high end is clear, but if you look at other levels of moderate intake, a little bit of social drinking, the evidence is actually a little bit different. So, in fact, alcohol consumption was associated with a lower level of disability. Hey! Alcohol consumption was associated with a lower time to an EDSS of 6. So you actually got that quicker. So there it wasn't so good. And one of our own studies also saw a protective effect of drinking a little bit of alcohol was actually a good thing in terms of conversion to MS. So we're not quite sure what's going on. But what we see in some of the other work outside MS as well, is what we call a U-shaped curve. So initially some alcohol, and it seems to be like red wine, you might have heard might be a good thing for you. You see some reduction, but once you get to a certain level, that risk really increases. So it looks like there's something like that going on. But in terms of actually, having a solid evidence-based behind the recommendation, I don't think we have too much to actually provide clear guidelines apart from saying, okay, don't use excessive alcohol. So what about nutrition and diet? They're very quiet on that in this document that they put together. So what we know is, so many diets out there. And the other thing, what we know is that people with MS are searching for diet. So this is online searches on the internet, and diet comes out as the number one search. That's what people want to know. They're interested in it. So, and in our Australian MS longitudinal study, about 21% actually uses one of those diets. And I'm sure many have tried them before, or it might be a similar thing, not actually stick with a particular diet, but just gone through a slightly healthier diet. When you look at the evidence, so this study is where we combined, this is one study that we did, where we looked at all the really good quality studies, randomized controlled trials, to see whether if you stick to a particular diet, do you see particular outcomes, or when you stick to particular nutrients, do you see improvements in outcomes? And overall, there's just not really the evidence is not that solid. So the thing that we came up with, vitamin D, there seems some evidence, but there's actually not the strongest evidence when you look at the randomized controlled trials. I'll talk about that in a minute. The polyunsaturated fatty acids, there's some contradictory evidence. There's the ginkgo biloba, no effect on cognitive function, only a single study, so no replication. And biotin, there was one really nice study, significant effect on disability progression, but at the moment there's no replication. So often what we need is, when we do those studies, just one study showing a significant effect isn't going to change the world straight away. What we'd like to see some consistency in those findings. So overall, not too much evidence, but diet is incredibly complex if you think about all the nutrients that you take and how they all combine together. And I think what we need is slightly different ways of looking at it from the research perspective. If you look at the evidence, a lot of studies have focused on individual foods or individual nutrients. And you can imagine that seeing an effect with just looking at one individual nutrient is going to be incredibly challenging, because it all sits in the background of all those other things that you eat. So one of the new things that we're starting to do is look at what's called dietary patterns. We basically take everybody's diet and then we put the statistics over the top and say who kind of eats similarly, and can we create kind of a diet or a dietary pattern out of all of these people. So one study that we did with the Ausimmune study, which is where we compare cases and controls, what we found that those who had the healthier diet, they actually had a lower risk of getting MS. So that looks like that method might work. And in our Auslong study, where we're basically following all these people over time, so these were people that, when they came into our study, only had a first event of demyelination, and so they had not been diagnosed with MS yet, and we followed these people over time up to 5, 10, and now we're going up to 15 years. So we're going to see whether that dietary patterns to basically whether a healthy pattern or a more unhealthy pattern, whether that is associated with good disease outcomes. The other thing that we're looking at is sort of diet quality. So create some indexes around the quality of somebody's diet. And the other thing that's out there is what's called the inflammatory index. So some foods are more inflammatory than others, and so can we create an index around that? Depending on what people eat, they get a score and see whether that is associated with outcomes. So a number of different ways that we're starting to look at diet. And in terms of the intervention studies, you'll be very pleased to hear we recently had a modifiable lifestyle workshop organised by MS Research Australia. And Terry Weil was there from the US, and George Jelinek also attended. And I presume they are people that you've all heard of. But Terry Weil promotes her particular diet, and what she is now going to do is actually do a trial to see whether, comparing the Weil diet to the Swank diet, so she's putting them head to head and looks at what the effects are. So what we need is the comparison to a control arm, either people who don't use a diet, because we know that once we start observing people that changes will happen, and we don't want that just because they are in a study and making changes. So the comparison group is always very important, and the randomization is very important, because once you randomize the people in two groups, they should be relatively similar, because you put everybody on a pile that wants to be in the study, and then you randomize them. So theoretically they should be the same in terms of age and sex and what they normally do as well. And then one you give the intervention, and the other one you give an alternative intervention or no intervention, and then you follow them both over time. So that is the ideal way of assessing whether these diets have an effect. And there's another study happening from one of my close colleagues, Anne-Louise Ponsonby, where she uses a number of supplements, a combination that basically has some evidence behind it that it influences your mitochondrial support, and she's interested to see whether that has an influence on fatigue as the primary outcome, and I think also depression. So that study has been funded by NHMRC. Oh, I went one too far. Yep. So, as I said, that I've worked a lot around vitamin D, showed that it was associated with the onset of the MS, and also showed that it's been associated with relapses. So that's kind of how we go through it. You do your observational studies first, you show that you have an effect, and then you need to do the clinical trials, because it's the clinical trials that are incredibly expensive. When we do an observational study, you can do a study where you look at so many different factors at the same time. So you do one study and you get about 50 publications out of it. We often measure outcomes in terms of publications, because every publication has something novel to say. So then you have one study and you get so many different outcomes out of that study. With a randomized controlled trial, you basically only look at one thing, and that one thing is, does that intervention have an effect, yes or no? So they are incredibly expensive studies for the number of outcomes that you get, but they are the ultimate outcome that you're after. So you don't spend all your money straight away on that. So that's why you go first, you do the slightly cheaper studies. They still are about $1 million, but so you still do those studies first before you move to the trials. So that's what we did with vitamin D, built up quite a bit of evidence to say, yes, that is justified to do a clinical trial, and they are now in progress, and the small trials haven't actually been so convincing. So you go through all that effort, and then at the end of the day, the trials are not stacking up. The bigger trials are still in progress. The Solarium trial saw no effects on the primary outcomes, but it did see some effects on secondary outcomes. And the big Australia-New Zealand study, Prevance, is still in progress, so we're waiting to hear for that. So, and that's also working out what dosage do you need to give. Do we need to, is just 1,000 international units a day enough, or 2,000, or do we need to push it up to 10,000 a day? So some people think, if you give a little bit, that's good, and if you give a lot more, then surely that must be a lot better. But that quite often doesn't hold. So to work out the correct dosage is very important. So the Prevance trial has different groups having the different dosages. And then there's, of course, the question, is it the UV or the supplementation? Because vitamin D is closely linked to UV. And in our MS risk studies, we saw that both were actually important. And we've always have those discussions when at work, is it one or the other? Can we simply give somebody a supplement? Because that's nice and easy. It's much easier to do than tell somebody to go out in the sun, where it's so hard, where you get the sun smart messages going over the top of you as well. But yeah, you have to be careful. But at the end of the day, for me, I would definitely go outside as much as you can, soak up a bit of the sun. Of course, never get burns. It probably has nice effects on your mental health anyway, because, gosh, I feel a lot better if I go outside. You get a bit of physical activity, you get a bit of sunshine, and it feels a lot better. So for me, that's a no-brainer. So then at the end of the day, what do we recommend? And I think we don't have any more evidence than to say, okay, eat healthy. Use the Australian guidelines for healthy eating. And at this point in time, from the evidence perspective, that's all we can recommend. What you want to do in your own life, please go ahead and trial some of those diets, because they might work for you individually. But from the big picture perspective, from the research evidence, this is all we can advise at the moment. Okay, getting to taking other medications. So basically what the Brain Health Initiative is telling us, next slide. If you have other diseases, be responsible for monitoring and managing them, including taking any prescribed medications. Conditions such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, and diabetes can worsen the MS course. So I've been working on what we call comorbidities. They are other diseases on top of your MS. And we basically asked people, okay, what other medical conditions do you have at the moment? And we went through a whole list where people say yes, no, yes, no. And if they had a particular condition, we asked, did you already have that before the onset of the MS? And what we were interested in is to see what happened at the time of the onset. Were things already more common compared to the general population? Because ultimately that's what we're interested in, not just the actual rate of the comorbidity, but whether the rate is actually more common in people with MS. And then we wanted to see, okay, over that duration of MS to the current age, is there a difference? Are those other health conditions actually becoming even more common? And this is what we saw. So if we look at the greater than 1, that is at the time of the diagnosis or the onset, those comorbidities like depression and anxiety, high cholesterol, psoriasis, cancer, migraine, and anemia, they already were more common at the onset. And then when you went to the actual current age, you see the arrow going to the right, they became much more prevalent again. So there seems to be that there is an increase. So then there were a bunch of conditions that were not more common at the time of at the onset, such as stomach disorders, epilepsy, hypertension, thyroid disorders, osteoarthritis, but they also became more common, and you see the arrows going to the right for all of it. So it basically showed that you're more at risk of getting other comorbidities, of getting other health conditions. So the big question is, can we prevent some of these happening? And what we know is that if you have these conditions, that basically you have a bigger chance of having a delay in your diagnosis. You have a bigger chance of already at the diagnosis having a higher disability. You have a bigger chance of having a faster disability progression. And the data on the relapse rates and MRI outcomes are not that consistent. But basically there's definitely a picture emerging that having those other health conditions on top of your MS is not a good thing. So basically, for me, there seems to be sufficient evidence to actually what we want to identify them early and manage them really well. So there's a job for your neurologist, and we were actually hoping to work on some guidelines around this and create those guidelines to increase the awareness amongst neurologists, amongst GPs as well, that they should be on the alert for this. But of course, you've got your own role to play in this as well, to be aware that this is important. So yeah, this will be some work in progress that I'd like to carry forward. When we talk about the disease-modifying therapies, we basically all know there's substantial evidence that they have really good effects on relapses. They have really good effects on the different MRI outcomes that your neurologist is interested in. We know that early treatment is better than delayed treatment. But there's a lot less evidence in terms of the long-term effects on disability progression, because often the clinical trials are only being done for a couple of years, and ideally we need studies that go for 10 years. So that evidence is a lot less, and there's also no evidence whether it, for example, affects other outcomes such as employment outcomes. So this was one thing that our group was interested in, and we basically asked people we asked our people in the Australian MS longitudinal study, have you taken any disease-modifying therapies over the last 5 years? And if so, do you believe that taking those disease-modifying therapies increased or decreased your employment outcomes? And then we asked, okay, which of the disease-modifying therapies do you believe had most of that effect? And then we categorised those disease-modifying therapies in the sort of the category 1s, the original injectables, and the category 2, they are the slightly more, have a higher efficacy, and then the category 3 ones, for example, natalizumab, they are believed to have the highest efficacy, but they of course also have the biggest adverse profile, so that's always challenging for the neurologist to compare those things. But this was basically the results that we saw, that those people who basically used the higher efficacy DMTs, they were 2 to 3 times more likely to report an increased amount of work. So that's that number, 2.84. So we are comparing to the injectables. So compared to the injectables, the category 1 DMTs, that they were much more likely to report a category 3 in terms of increases in amount of work. This one, the 3.114, is increase in the work attendance, and this one increases in work productivity. So that's quite promising, very powerful data, and that has just been accepted to a very good journal that we're very pleased with. I heard that yesterday. And when you do some of the head-to-head comparisons, we basically saw that fingolimod and natalizumab came out the best with really strong effects when you compare them to the beta interference. So just another little piece of information that those disease-modifying therapies, they seem to be doing the job for many different outcomes. In terms of employment and work productivity, we basically know overall the cost of MS is about $1 billion, and about half of that is due to loss of employment and absenteeism. You know, people... There's a cost-benefit analysis that you need to do when you're working. You know, there's financial security, there's a sense of identity when you work, there's a purpose, there's a reason to get up, there's socialization, there's a benefit to others, but there's also, of course, the additional burden. So it's often challenging to try to keep working, but you also know there's a lot of sense of achievement and some good benefits from working as well. So one of our recent papers was called Closing the Gap. We basically showed that the employment gap had substantially reduced. So people with MS are much more likely to stay and work at the moment compared to quite a few years ago. So that's a really nice story to tell, and hopefully some of the disease-modifying therapies have been a big part in that. There was basically no gap for women, but the men still had a bit of a gap. The men seem to have like a fight or flight. I fight it as long as I can, and then I just disappear altogether, give up. Women probably are much more moderate, and they might be reducing their working hours, but they try to stay in the workforce as long as they can. Also, the age of retirement had increased from 52 in 2007 to 57, so that's a nice bit of evidence as well. But of course, many still retire due to MS, actually because they have MS. 73% for women and 90% for men. So that is definitely the reason that they are retiring early. So when we looked at, in the Australian MS longitudinal study about, we looked at actual work productivity, because that was something that hadn't been looked at a lot. So this is work productivity loss because of being absent, because you were sick, you couldn't work, so you had to have days off. That's called absenteeism. And then you have a concept that we call presenteeism. You're present, but you're actually not as productive. So, you know, for me, I don't feel 100%. I'm a bit sick, but I still go to work. And I really know that my productivity wasn't 100% that day. It was more like 60%. So when we looked at that for people with MS, in the previous 4 weeks, they estimated that their total mean work productivity loss was around 2.5 days, about 14% of lost productive time. And the absenteeism component was 0.6 days, and the presenteeism component was 1.9 days. So roughly, quite a bit higher for the presenteeism. Seems to be more important than the actual absenteeism. Overall, this is not, there are other diseases that have much higher rates. So overall, I would say people with MS are incredibly productive. And this is mainly driven by the symptoms. So the symptoms, fatigue, cognition, pain, sensory symptoms. So that really highlights the need to improve the management. So one of the things that we are working on at the moment is an intervention called MS WorkSmart. It's basically an online intervention with telephone support. And it's basically people are guided through different modules. They do quizzes, some homework activity, a lot of engagement. And we have people with MS that assist us to set that up, and we basically cover different aspects such as personal coping behaviour, strategies for problem-focused coping, learn how sort of unhelpful thoughts are influencing behaviour, the stuff that Sally was talking about, identify the possible modifications of the work environment, work on effective communication with employers and colleagues, and information around what kind of supports can I put in place that will assist a person. So it's a very exciting project where we're working together with psychologists, with IT people, with occupational therapists, myself. So a nice team of people, and it will be very tailored. It will have some level of gamification to keep it interesting, otherwise you know, tune out very quickly. It will have some interaction with peers where you can share things, and it will also have assistance from a coach psychology perspective. So hopefully we're at the moment in a development phase. We then will conduct a feasibility study, do a full clinical trial, and roll that out to people with MS. So that's a watch this space. All right, the last 1 minute I want to spend on something that the Menzies is currently working on, something new, working on integrating research and practice. So we're setting up an MS research and translation network. So this will be Australia-wide and ultimately the world. Thinking big, want to have an increased focus on, you know, often as researchers, we do our research and that's where we end. And then we hope that people at the MS Society pick up what we do. ideally there needs to be an integration to get the translation working better. So it's, for us, it's not just about publishing those papers, it's getting that evidence into practice, and how can we do that? So working across that spectrum is what we're hoping to do, bring people together, bring MS Research, MS Society people together. And one of the things we're working on at the moment is to develop an online course that has a lot of the evidence-based information in it, courses that people with MS, carers, health professionals can do, has a lot of information about treatments, about the management of MS, and hopefully over time a lot of people will become part of our network, to have that increased focus on how to translate all the evidence into practice, and ultimately hoping that will work towards Kiss Goodbye to MS. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ingrid. That was extremely relevant, given that today is around research, the theme for World MS Day being research. So, so great to hear what's happening here in Australia as well.